Hello, everyone. I am Michael Steelman, Director of Alumni Career Development and Professional Engagement for William & Mary. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Day 4 of William & Mary's 2024 Professional Development Week. William & Mary is your career partner for life. The university has committed to lead in the preparation of lifelong learners equipped to navigate rapid change and thrive from their first job to their last. This week of programming, designed for the entire William & Mary community, covers a variety of topics relevant to people at all points of their career journey. When designing the sessions, we focused on the NACE career competencies, which are career and self-development, communication, equity and inclusion, leadership, professionalism, teamwork, and technology. We are truly grateful for the continued engagement of our William & Mary community to support one another's professional success. I want to acknowledge and thank all the William & Mary volunteers and colleagues who expressed their willingness to help on One Network, have taken the time to prepare remarks, advise us on topics, and serve as networking hosts throughout the country. Without your guidance, support, and expertise, this week would not be possible. I'm joined today by my colleagues and co-planners, Kelly O'Shaughnessy and Alex Beard. You'll hear more from them later on in this session. Before I turn things over to our great panel today, I just have a few technology items to cover. Today's session is being recorded, and we will notify all registrants once the recording is available. Questions are also welcome throughout the presentation. If you go ahead and just roll over your Zoom menu options, you'll see a Q&A button. Use that for your question submission. Kira will monitor that and take questions as she has time allotted for. We will also be monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions related to the event, please feel free to put them in the chat as well. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our terrific panel today to discuss understanding the ethics and power of AI in the workplace. First, we have a 2017 alumna and research fellow at New America, Gabrielle Hibbert. Next, we have class of 2010 alumna and Director of Partnerships and Communication for William & Mary's Global Research Institute, Kira Allmann. And last but not least, we have class of 2009 alumna and head of communications and content at the Lovelace Institute, Catherine Gregory. No matter where you are in your career, we hope today's conversation will encourage you to think about ways you can understand and leverage technologies ethically to enhance efficiencies, complete tasks, and accomplish your goals. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Kira Allmann, to facilitate today's discussion. Thanks so much, Kira.
Thank you so much, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to give Gabrielle and Catherine a chance to introduce themselves a bit further in just a moment. But first, I'd just like to welcome you all to this panel on the impact and ethics of artificial intelligence in the workplace. What an interesting topic. I'm Kira Allmann. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Communications at the William & Mary Global Research Institute, and I am also an academic researcher. So for a little more context on how I wound up moderating this panel on AI and the future of work, I'm a digital anthropologist, and I specialize in studying digital inequality and the digital divide. I do a lot of work on how to give members of the public, so folks like you and me, more agency and autonomy over digital infrastructure, data, and the technologies that impact our lives. I'm also a graduate of William & Mary class of 2010, so go Tribe. This panel is about artificial intelligence and the future of work. In particular, we're going to be talking about the impact AI is having in the workplace, what ethical questions arise when we work with AI or when AI does work for us, and how to approach the ethical challenges that this new technology poses. AI is a very hot topic right now, in case you hadn't noticed. And for many of us, AI is something completely new. It's suddenly seemingly taken over the news, it's appearing in all of our apps, and it seems like everyone is talking about it. You can't even buy an appliance these days without the mention of AI being a selling point. And in many ways, AI is new. It is absolutely revolutionizing how we work and how things work. We are at an exciting moment in the development of AI as a technology. But it's also important to remember that in many ways, AI is not new. Technological innovation has always resulted in waves of wonderment, and it's always been the cause of social and technical change. So we do need to put AI in that broader context as we're having this discussion. Now, believe it or not, there was a time when we talked about the internet, for instance, in the same superlative and existential ways that we talk about AI now. And long before that, the steam engine was a world-altering technology. So as we launch into this discussion, it's going to be important for us to remember that AI is part of that technological legacy. It's part of our technological history and our future. And we want to put it in context. It's also going to be important for us to remember that AI is a very broad term that covers a wide range of technologies and technological systems. So when most of us think about AI today, we're probably thinking about ChatGPT, which is the kind of AI that's known as a large language model or an LLM. And we very well may veer into talking a bit about ChatGPT today. I would expect that we will. But also, please remember that AI encompasses a lot of other use cases that we may not touch on today. And it's actually been used for a while. It's not necessarily completely new in many fields, like healthcare, graphic design, engineering. The list really goes on and on. So it's important to keep in mind that AI is actually already an everyday technology, and we're probably all using it or subject to it in one way or another. And in many ways, we might not even know it. So with those kind of initial framing notes in mind, let's dig right into it. Let's talk about AI and work. So please remember, for those of you tuning into the webinar, that you can put any questions you may have for the panel in the Q&A window, and I'll be coming to that Q&A window a bit later in the conversation. So I'm so excited, very happy to be here with Gabrielle Hibbert and Catherine Gregory. Gabrielle is a fellow at New America, as you heard Michael say earlier, doing research on data, equity, and consumer rights. And Catherine is head of communications at the Ada Lovelace Institute in London, where I also used to work as a researcher. And that's where Catherine translates the wide-ranging work that Ada does on data, AI, and society to external audiences. Something you will definitely notice in hearing from all of us is that, well, first of all, we all went to William & Mary, so we all have a liberal arts background. So the three of us approach technology as a social phenomenon and a social issue as much as it is a technological one. We are not necessarily technical experts, but we are experts. And we hope you'll leave this conversation feeling confident in your own expertise, confident in your ability to ask vital human questions about the technologies that impact our lives and our humanity. So without further ado, I would like to pass over to Gabrielle. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Super excited to be here. Thank you so much, Kira and Michael, for the amazing ground setting for this really, really fascinating discussion today. I'm Gabrielle. My pronouns are she, they. And as Kira and Michael noted, I am at New America doing my research on data policy, nutrition, labeling. Before joining New America, I spent my time as a security engineer at a Berlin-based startup. And before that, worked in legislative affairs on Capitol Hill. I engage in AI ethically through my research and specifically within the space of explainability and transparency. I also teach a course on race, technology, and policy at Brandeis University and graduated the college in 2017 with a dual major in Russian post-Soviet studies and German. And the cherry on top is that I also used to have a radio show at WCWM.
Didn't get to unmute fast enough there. Thanks so much, Gabrielle. Over to you, Catherine. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit further?
Yes, of course. And thanks, Kira and Michael, all of the William and Mary staff, and also everyone who's joined. I'm really excited to have this important and provocative conversation. As mentioned, I am the head of communications and content at the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is an independent research institute in London with a mission to make AI and data work for people and society. So at AI, I oversee our external communications, our brand and reputation, and also our editorial process. Before Ada, I led the marketing and communications team at Working Families, which is the UK's national charity for working parents and carers. One of my favorite things about working in comms is the opportunity to translate complex concepts into messages that make people feel and think and act. And I can't think of a domain where this is more needed than AI. I graduated from William & Mary in 2009 with an English major and a French minor. I was also a copy editor on the Flat Hat, which has served me really well in my current role. A huge part of it is editorial editing research papers. So another way that William & Mary has helped me in my career.
Amazing. It's so wonderful to have you both here on the panel. I do notice that we have yet another thing in common, and that we all studied languages at William & Mary and had some kind of connection to communication, broadly speaking. So I was a linguistics major, linguistics and government double major, and I studied Arabic for all 4 years at William & Mary, and I went on to continue studying and working in Arabic in my graduate studies. So I'm curious if you both think that there's something connected between your interest in technology, so the path that you took to wind up working on data, AI, and these kinds of questions of technological innovation, and your backgrounds that involve languages and, of course, you know, a broad liberal arts education. Catherine, maybe I'll throw this one to you first.
Sure, absolutely. So as an English major, I always reflect on something that Professor Adam Potke, and I don't know if he's still at William & Mary, but he was one of my favorite professors. And he once told us that English majors can do everything or nothing, which is a funny way of characterizing a major. But I think the point is, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I might have lost my connection.
Only
Am I
briefly,
still
Catherine.
there?
You just dropped out for a second. So
Okay, I'm so sorry.
yeah.
My screen just went blank. The whole point is that I think being an English major, but also an entire liberal arts education, sort of opens up your world. And I was never really inclined in the sciences or technology, but I'm in this space because I've developed skills to look at certain topics from a variety of different angles, and to also be able to communicate these topics in a way that can change hearts and minds. So, and I learned a lot of that skill from William & Mary.
Brilliant. What about you, Gabrielle?
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting question and is one that really grounds the work that I do. You know, being a Russian and German major, a lot of what I wanted to do at that time was translation. I loved kind of looking at syntax and figuring out how is the best way to have this make sense culturally and linguistically in another language. And that has really worked well in my understanding of technology, but broadly, but also specifically with regard to coding. There are a lot of parallels between learning a programming language as well as having that background in foreign languages. I think it's a really interesting way to look at communication, with which Catherine was kind of pointing out earlier. But also, I don't want to kind of demean or think about the idea that that cultural component isn't as necessary as learning the syntax as well. So I think it's a very interesting way to have your liberal arts education kind of help progress your ideas and thinking in the realm of STEM.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I love that you both touched on translation as well, in thinking through the value of that liberal arts background when you're working in tech space. A big piece of working well with AI is understanding it. And so we have a lot of conversations about explainability and transparency in relation to AI. And this is only going to become a bigger issue. If you can be a translator between the very technical world and language of tech development and the technologies themselves that are impacting our lives, and a broader public, whatever that public is, whatever your community is, that's a really valuable skill. And I think we've all found ourselves kind of in that position in one way or another. So I think it's really, really interesting how, you know, you take a circuitous path to this point. I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit, and I'd like to know a bit about how you each approach AI in your own work experience. So first of all, I would like to know if you use AI at work, and if you do, how you use it. What are some of your reflections on your use of AI. So maybe Gabrielle, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'll talk about the use first. I have used AI in my places of work. I think what has been incredibly helpful, especially with regard to ensuring that the colleagues that don't have as much experience, who I work with, get to have the same experiences I do. We use AI in that capacity, using AI to summarize large text, meeting notes, things of that nature, the more clerical work that is often given to younger employees. That has been phenomenal in allowing there to be more time for stretch opportunities for staff members that I've worked with. Outside of that, I definitely approach the use of AI a bit more skeptically due to my security engineering background. I think we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but I do think there are a couple of things to note when thinking about engaging with or using AI within the workplace. And that kind of speaks to that AI governance piece that I think is incredibly important to establish when you are considering using AI in the workplace.
Yeah, I think that's really, it's a very interesting point, especially because you juxtapose sort of some of the challenges and as well as the sort of conveniences, the opportunities of sort of taking some menial tasks maybe off of the desk of employees. I always think back to, I think it was an op-ed written by Timothy Wu a number of years ago called The Tyranny of Convenience, and how it's, you know, a double-edged sword. So yeah, it's very, very interesting. Catherine, what about you? Do you use AI, and how do you use it if you do?
Sure. So I can speak to this particularly as a comms professional, which is a field that requires quite a lot of creativity. And I think particularly large language models like ChatGPT can be really helpful at the brainstorming stage. Or as Gabrielle said, communications professionals often have to horizon scan and be very up to date with the latest research. So if you have a lot of sort of text-heavy research reports to read, then it can be really helpful for summarizing wordy documents. But what I always say is that AI tools like this are a starting point and not an end point. They have to be fact-checked. We've all heard about the lawyer who used ChatGPT for a legal brief and then quickly learned that AI had just made up some laws. So that was, that's one use in the workplace where it's very clear that AI needs fact-checking tools like this need fact-checking. And also from a comms perspective and as someone who writes for a job, it will never replace a human sense of humor or sense of connection with an audience. I was saying in our pre-meet last week that I was really stuck on the title of a report on AI and education. So I asked ChatGPT to generate some ideas just as a jumping off point that had a pun. And ChatGPT served me AI of the tiger scratching the surface of education. And it was terrible. And it actually comforted me because it made me realize that these tools can't replicate a human sense of humor.
It's nice to know that we're still needed in the communications process. I am kind of curious in the context of your workplace more broadly, and you don't have to keep it focused on where you currently work, you know, the various places you've worked in your career to date. How is the decision to use or not use AI being made? Do you find there is a clear decision? Is there clear guidance from the workplace as a whole, from your employer? And how does that come about? Maybe I'll start with Catherine this time. I'll put you back in the hot seat.
Sure, that's fine. So working at a research institute, and particularly one that focuses on AI and data, the question of using AI tools in our research is very much a live one, and it's centered around the principles of robust research design. So we don't want to use any tools that conflict with a rigorous research process. For example, a key principle in research integrity is transparency. And if you use an AI tool that draws on an opaque and unreferenced evidence base, it's really difficult to have a clear understanding of where the information is coming from. So right now we err on the side of caution, particularly when it comes to using AI tools with our research. But we're in the process of evaluating different uses for AI tools and research, and also paying attention to what other organizations in our space are doing as well.
What about you, Gabrielle?
Yeah, has definitely depended on the workplace and the sector for me. Most recently, we did use a lot of AI, particularly within the health policy space in regards to organ allocation and distribution. And in that regard, we had robust processes in place, and we're working with a couple of different research institutions to ensure that there was equity and a way for our processes to be as transparent as possible. However, that was a very special case, essentially. On the other hand, I've worked in other kind of sectors where it's definitely dependent on the department that I was working in or the type of material I was working with. I think one of the biggest things that I think is important to keep in mind is that risk management framework that should be in place before any company or organization decides to use any such tooling, because weighing it early on in the process will hopefully help prevent issues and problems that may arise along the process.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious what you each think the value of having a stated policy on AI is in a workplace. When we think about how do we mitigate the unintended consequences of using these kinds of technologies, how do we take into account the risks, as you just mentioned, Gabrielle, is a guideline, is a policy on paper the way to do that in your experience, or is it an open question? Catherine, I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, so this is something that I can kind of relate to the wider question of AI regulation as a whole. So the UK Prime Minister very recently said that right now it's impossible to regulate AI because it's moving so fast. And I think that's quite a narrow, I personally think that that's quite a narrow interpretation. I think that we can make rules around fast changing technology. And in a workplace, potentially the best way to do this, and I might touch on this a little bit later too, is to co-design some of these processes with the employees that will actually be using the technologies. That's a really important factor, particularly as it's as Gabrielle may have mentioned, it might be the more junior staff members who are really impacted by the use of AI. So yeah, I think it's never an easy thing, right, to create a rule book on something that's constantly evolving. But it's a good aspiration to potentially have a policy that can grow and change as the technology does as well.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And Gabrielle, in your experience, what's the value of having a guideline? And you mentioned having protections against risks as well. I'm wondering if you've seen any examples. What does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, before I answer that question, I want to kind of get to the pre-question for this, really. So that question you need to ask your organization is, do we need to use AI? I think that is a nice way to kind of ground the discussion and the future policies that may come from this discussion. Because having been in a lot of emerging tech spaces, I think there is often a want to be at the kind of cutting edge of what technology is doing right now. But I think that doing a bit of pre-work and assessing whether this tool is going to be helpful with regard to what you're working with is a very important question to answer. Outside of that, I will say that for me, using that security mindset, I am very keen at looking at what types of information will be processed using that tool. What is the sensitivity like? And you kind of use the NIST risk management framework to help guide your teams as well. I think it provides a really wonderful matrix in terms of kind of figuring out how, if you do plan to use an AI-based tool, where it may or may not slot into place for your organization. In addition to that, I do believe that ensuring that there is a robust encryption scheme that is being used. How is the data being processed? Has it been audited? I think that is a very important piece to using technology, especially if you work within sensitive areas of different sectors.
I know that the Ada Lovelace Institute as well has done a bit of work on algorithmic impact assessments, for instance, as another tool for doing risk evaluation, AIAs, and in the UK in particular, things like the algorithmic transparency standard are kind of moving in the direction of putting out into the public domain the ways in which algorithmic tools, AI being one kind, are being used in various sectors, in particular in the public sector. So there's kind of a whole sort of suite of possible tools out there. I think it's really interesting you mentioned the NIST framework as well, Gabrielle, and I don't think we've quite alighted on sort of what the one silver bullet is going to be, and it's very unlikely, spoiler alert, that we're ever going to find one specific thing that will be the answer, that will help us mitigate all risks associated with new technologies. But it's really useful to kind of be exploring what options there are and to be testing them, like putting them to the test out in the wild, and that's arguably kind of the harder thing to do. I'm going to take a step back now from sort of your own work experience and talk more broadly about AI and work for a little bit. And before we do that, I'm just going to remind everyone who's tuning in that you can ask questions in the chat, and you can put your question in at any time because I'll be able to come to them later when we get to the Q&A section of the conversation. So please feel free to use that Q&A function in your Zoom window. So taking a step back and thinking more broadly about AI and the workplace, what would you say are some of the ethical and rights-based concerns? We've started touching on this a little bit, but I think you both have experience from different vantage points on what those concerns might be when it comes to AI and the future of work. Gabrielle, would you like to start us off?
Yes, I think that there are so many components to this, which makes it all the more interesting, but also very tricky. And I would say my top two that come to mind are non-consensual data exchange between your personal data and the tool that you're choosing to use. That's a big discussion within the field of data privacy. And it's one that I think we are starting to kind of tease out currently. And, recently there have been more discussions on, how can we best protect our personal data? President Biden just issued an executive order to help protect Americans' sensitive personal data. This conversation is going to keep evolving as more and more different AI-based tools become commonplace on the market. Outside of that, I will say that there is that cultural and societal component to it that has been starting to be discussed a bit, but still needs to be, analyzed a bit more. And what I mean by that is the organizations that are creating these tools need to ensure that there is a diverse kind of thought going into the creation of this tooling. There is a lot of research going into how the teams that are building these tools have and impart their own biases into the tools that they create. So how can we ensure that the tools that go to market are as equitable as possible? So those are two things that I really think about when it comes to the ethical component and the rights-based component within the AI sector.
Thanks, Gabrielle. What about you, Catherine? What are some of the ethical and rights-based concerns, considerations we should have?
Of course. And sorry if you hear my dog barking in the background, I really apologize. She is relentless. So I think I'd like to talk a bit about AI and its use in recruitment. So I think there's a misconception that by virtue of not being human, AI technologies sort of transcend the very human traits of bias and of preconceived notions that might influence something like recruitment. But as we all know, there's no such thing as a perfect or an infallible system, and many AI technologies are biased in the same way that human beings are. One example of this is the use of machine learning models to assess video interviews of candidates. This is something I've just written a case study on at the Lovelace Institute. So companies use this type of technology to automate parts of the interview process. And the way the technology works is that it analyzes facial expressions and speech patterns to infer qualities or characteristics about applicants. So certain tones of voice or facial expressions might indicate that a person is conscientious, for example. And this technology sort of draws those conclusions based on facial and vocal data. So this type of technology, though, it could disadvantage, for example, neurodivergent candidates who might not fit the ideal speech or facial patterns identified by these systems. Another example, and this is a more high profile one, of AI and bias in recruitment happened in 2018. So Amazon's hiring algorithm was found to discriminate against women. And the reason this happened is that it turns out the data that was used to train the algorithm on what a good candidate looks like were mostly resumes from men. And so this really goes to show that if the data is biased, the algorithm will be biased too. Garbage in, garbage out.
I'd really like to highlight something you both touched on in that answer, which is the importance of data in this conversation. Data is kind of the resource that powers these algorithmic systems. It powers AI. And you both talked about it almost on different sides of the equation, so to speak. Gabrielle, you mentioned what data we're giving up, basically. What are we putting into these systems? Every time that we use a tool like ChatGPT, we're contributing data to the broader database of content that it can learn and train from. It's obviously a bit more complex than that brief summary, but essentially you are giving up data in order to participate in the system. And Catherine, you mentioned that these algorithms, these algorithmic systems, AI-driven systems are trained on data. There are data training sets, and the data that goes into that training process can result in kind of biased outcomes when the system winds up interpreting new data that gets fed into the system. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit more about the literacies that people need. What do we need to know? What are the competencies that we should have when engaging with algorithmic systems? Because it strikes me that we've been talking broadly about AI, but there's this data component as well. Gabrielle, would you like to start us off with that?
Yeah, definitely. In terms of competencies, I think what can be best is going back to understanding those key components of what data is, right? I think it can be hard, especially when we are engaging with different tools and we're kind of signing up and checking boxes for the consent for the privacy policy, the use of user agreement, terms of use, things of that nature. There is a lot of jargon, both technical and legal, in there. And there needs to be more of a way to accessibly communicate what exactly is happening on the user end. So that kind of feeds a little bit into my personal research work. I know that there have been a lot of attempts at creating more accessible language around the data itself, but there hasn't really been any focused on the consumer side. But outside of that, I think that there need to be more conversations on what at its basic core, the tools that we use in this toolkit are and how we can move forward with possibly integrating them. I think that, as you mentioned earlier at the start of this talk, we have been using AI-based tools for a very long time. We just haven't really noticed it until the fever pitch in the media alerted us to this moment. But those two on top of the security layer that I have mentioned earlier, I think are the three biggest components in my view.
What about you, Catherine? What would you say are the necessary competencies we need?
Sure. I think when it comes to using AI tools in the workplace, we need to be realistic about their capabilities and also have an understanding of, as I mentioned before, like the implicit biases that are within the data used to train these systems. I think we need to acknowledge that these tools are not always a source of truth, and we need to approach them with skepticism as well. I think there's, and this is just my personal view, I often think back to my education and wish that I had taken a class on how to do my taxes or on how to do just like normal life things that I sometimes struggle with right now. And I think AI is becoming so integrated into our everyday lives, right? I mean, algorithms decide who gets approved for a loan. In one case during the pandemic in the UK, they decided what grade children got on their final exams, which are really important. And so I think AI technologies are so widely available and becoming even more so that they're becoming a practical part of our lives. And so that kind of education, even starting early in schooling, could be a way to develop our knowledge and the knowledge of future generations on this technology and to help us use it in a smart and safe way.
It's also worth pointing out, alongside, this relatively high level discussion about a very advanced technology, that there's still a pretty profound digital divide. There are many digital divides that cut across society where many people don't actually even have access or the basic digital competencies to use technologies like the internet or mobile phones or computers. And we saw this was a hot topic in the peak of the pandemic period. All of a sudden, it became apparent how many people were actually really struggling to make full use of the suite of tools that are available in the digital world today. And AI is an advanced tool that's increasingly part of our digital reality. But these digital divides still pervade society, and we really need to be thinking about how much greater those gaps, how much greater the inequalities might be when we add these additional advanced tools that certain people with certain privileges in certain workplaces are going to become extremely proficient in, while other members of society, other communities are increasingly left behind. I'm wondering how you both think about those kind of broader social inequalities around just access to this technology and the ability to develop competencies in the first place. Gabrielle, maybe let's start with you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you touch upon a very important aspect, that digital divide piece, which, you know, if there is going to be, and there will be, this acceleration of a need to understand what is newest, what's coming out, what's being used the most, we do need to pay particular attention about the potential for bias when it comes to hiring, for instance, or even within the organizations that we work within, how we may be biasing against our coworkers and our colleagues. I think a practical kind of way to go around that would be to hold workshops within your organizations. And I know that we all have tons of time within our workday, right? But if you do kind of push for the use of AI, I would also push for the use of these workshops for all of your colleagues to come in, ask questions, have a practitioner in the space to walk through getting that first level education on how to use it, instead of kind of having it be available without that education component to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Education is such a huge aspect of how we can approach AI ethically and responsibly in the workplace. What do you think about that, Catherine?
So I think I'd like to talk about the other side of the coin to education. So, which to me is something that we call at ADA public participation, right? It's listening to the perspectives of, in this case, working people who are using AI or who may be using AI in their day-to-day jobs. So we have to understand people's attitudes and lived experiences of these technologies in order to develop policies and practice that work for people in society. And this is especially important because it's often the people at the margins of society who experience the biggest harms from AI. So people who are, subject to the digital divide, as you were talking about, Kira, people living in poverty, minoritized groups, et cetera. So understanding people's perspectives and attitudes and lived experiences of data and AI is really essential to develop these policies. There are a lot of ways to involve people in decision making around the use of AI. And if we're talking about the workplace, maybe this looks like a company consulting its people on their concerns and their aspirations about the use of these technologies. Maybe it's about workers co-designing the terms of use of an AI system. So there's no single right way to do participation, and it may vary across contexts or workplaces, but the important thing is that people have a voice in how AI technologies are used.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. And I think it really links well with what Gabrielle was saying about really focusing on making time for those workshops in your workplace, bringing in the diverse perspectives of your own work community in building the policies around AI for one another, and also in increasing one another's literacy in the process about what are the issues that we need to be thinking about. I think it's a really important point, and you can get very creative with how you do that engagement in a meaningful way. I'm going to take the opportunity to throw in a question from the audience at this point. Let's see, we've got a few that have come in. Amy has asked, many organizations have turned off access to public AI, like OpenAI, ChatGPT, due to IP concerns. And we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. What are your thoughts about the tools for governance that are needed to address this?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take a stab at that. I think what my personal experience with this is engaging with the legal team that I have worked with. I think that they can provide a wealth of information on how best to integrate whatever AI tool you are considering for your organization. I think it also is interesting because it goes back to that data piece, the personal data of an organization. May not want to have their data used further to train more models and things of that nature. And I think what needs to be said before that, and still is, again, a very important framing question, is do you need to use it in the workplace? I think that can provide, honestly, the first step in thinking about governance of AI, but also the governance of any tool that an organization chooses to use.
What about you, Catherine? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's a brilliant question. I'd like to zoom out a little bit and talk about the governance of AI beyond even the workplace. So I think in the example that Amy gave, it's really interesting because it seems like these companies who are essentially banning the use of tools like this are quite risk averse. But conversely, in theory, there are also companies that are just really gung-ho and using tools without any kind of oversight. And there's clear evidence that despite good intentions, voluntary commitments from companies to develop or use AI in an ethical way aren't really that effective. We can't expect the companies that either create or use AI to grade their own homework. So instead, we need to view AI technologies as the powerful tools that they are. They have a potential for great benefit, but also the potential for great harm. And what we really need are laws and regulation at the top that keep people safe and secure a positive future for AI. And what this might look like in practice is tests for AI manufacturers in the way that cars are crash tested, liability for things that go wrong, like if a restaurant gives you food poisoning, a voice for people who are going to be impacted by AI, which I discussed earlier. And then also, and this is really important in the workplace in particular, the ability to contest a decision made about you by AI. And it's really only with these kinds of safeguards in place that we can truly make AI work for people and society and the world of work.
Definitely. And I think I would add to that it's just as important, to link back to both of your answers to the previous question. It's just as important to think about how those rules are made, whether they're regulations or whether they're just workplace policies, as it is the content of the rules themselves. So there is a difference to imposing kind of a top-down regulation, whether it's at the national, regional, or workplace level, and consulting the people who are actually impacted by the use of the technology in the process of developing the rules in the first place. And I think it's going to be increasingly important to make the process of rulemaking around technology more and more democratic and more participatory, which of course requires an educative component. We need greater data and digital literacy more broadly in order to participate in those conversations. But it is going to be important for the rules to be co-created. We often see that the rules being made around AI at the moment are not only are the technologies being built by a small handful of companies, but the rules are also being co-written with those companies and leadership from those companies. And we definitely need greater participation of the people whose lives are impacted by the effects of those technologies, whether that's people who are using it successfully to be more efficient and impactful in their work, or people whose jobs are being taken by these technologies or being eradicated by the increasing use, and everything in between. So I think it's really important to be thinking about the rules themselves and also how we make them. We have another question here from Mike, who's asking about the discussion around AI taking people's jobs. So it seems like that's a common sort of fear around technology, but there's also the great potential for AI to create jobs. I'm wondering, from both of your points of view, from your experience, what about that sort of positive potential of AI?
Yeah, I think that there is a huge upside to this, particularly as it relates to ensuring that there is that trust and safety component to the tools that are being developed. I know that trust and safety departments across the board have experienced a ton of layoffs in the tech sector. However, I do think that we will see a resurgence of a need for more trust and safety professionals, especially as we gain more and more AI-based tooling. And that's such an important sector to kind of have as we move forward. Outside of the trust and safety component, I do think having and creating more jobs around the security component is also going to be hugely needed. Uh, so those two I have major hope for.
That's really interesting. I think we've gone through a bit of a phase of some tech companies, thinking of, Twitter, X, sort of firing most of the trust and safety division in recent history, but maybe we're going to see a resurgence, actually, a recognition that in many ways this is one of the most valuable departments in a technology company. Such an interesting point, Gabrielle. Catherine, what do you think?
Yeah, so I am probably going to do the annoying thing of finding a middle ground here. So we often talk about AI creating jobs or AI destroying jobs, but I really like to think about the potential for AI to enhance our jobs. And this is something I recently co-wrote a paper with the Institute for the Future of Work, which is another research institute based in London, which sort of touched on this very prospect that the way we want to see the future of the world of work is not a future where AI is replacing humans, but one where AI is enhancing our capabilities or potentially, as Gabrielle touched on earlier, automating some of the more administrative part of our jobs. Oh, I would love AI. That would help me with budgeting. Honestly, that would be a game changer for me. But allowing us to shift our focus potentially, and if we value something like productivity, which a lot of organizations and a lot of people do, potentially help us to be more productive in our roles.
Yeah, I would. You mentioned taxes before, Catherine. I would love AI to do my taxes. Why?
Yes.
Yes, that would be amazing. But yeah, I think it's such a good point, Catherine, that it's worth thinking about how does AI actually enhance what we already do. It is, of course, we talk about disruption. It's a disruptive technology for sure, but it also can fit in many ways to the trajectories of our jobs and the future of work. And it's important to think about how it slots in and how it can actually help to enhance the work that we're already doing. Something that's kind of come up a bit, we touched on a bit earlier in the conversation, is one of the risks of AI is kind of an abstract risk. It's the risk that the decisions or the actions taken by AI-driven or AI-assisted technologies and systems are perceived as being somehow neutral or objective in ways that human decision-making isn't. And there's a very pervasive mythology around technologized decisions, that it will be more accurate, it will help us overcome bias. And in many ways, this is kind of one of the most difficult to tackle and insidious challenges of technologies like AI, because it's sort of about the philosophy, the ideology with which we approach those technologies. One good way of tackling those kinds of expectations, the sort of tacit expectation that technology is more objective and neutral than human beings, is to ask really good questions about technology, ask good questions of technology. And you both have posed a number of those kinds of questions throughout the conversation. So I'm wondering if we could close with a final thought from each of us on the panel. What is one question that you think we should all be asking about AI in relation to work? And we'll kind of compile them. They'll be a good set of questions to approach sort of how to use AI in the workplace, how to think about AI in the future of work. So yeah, what is one question you would leave our audience with today? Whichever of you, Catherine or Gabrielle, would like to start, go for it.
Yeah, I can go and say that from the team building and the workplace building aspect of that, if you are on or have an AI or tech-based team, what does your team look like? Is it a homogenous team with, all engineers? I would think about that and think how best to create diversity within that team, because that will create an even richer tool, a richer governance strategy, and hopefully a more equitable output. So that's my question in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gabrielle. What about you, Catherine? What's one question you would want us to be asking?
So the question I would ask comes from my experience at my last role trying to influence the UK government and move the dial in workplace policy. So that question is, how can we use AI in the workplace in a way that's good for people, good for business, and good for the economy? I think we see these three facets of society as often at odds with one another, but if we can find common ground there, I think it's a really helpful framing for any problem in the world of work, which has such significant impacts on people's livelihoods and on the success of businesses, and then also on the state of the economy as a whole. So in my last role, we built a case for stronger legal protections around flexible working in the UK. And we did this by building evidence on how it supports employees, how it improves productivity and increases the talent pool for businesses, and how it can also contribute to lower unemployment rates. And this framing was instrumental in convincing the UK government to pass a bill that made it a lot easier for employees to get the flexible working arrangements they need. And this law is actually coming into effect in April, which is very exciting. So back to AI, right? What does this have to do with AI? So in my personal view, we need to find that sweet spot where these technologies can be used for the benefit of not just the bottom line of a company, but also the benefit of people and society and the economy as a whole. And we need to ask ourselves what that would look like in practice. And spoiler alert, I don't have the answer, and I don't think anyone really does have the answer for this yet, but that should be the end goal.
Thank you so much, Catherine and Gabrielle. And I will just very briefly add that my question is very similar to Gabrielle's, actually. I always think it's very important to think about who a technology is made by and for, and who are the decision makers about that technology, who's part of the decision-making process. And once you sort of assess the answer to those questions, ask who is missing. Who is not in the rooms, who is not in the halls of power, making those decisions, influencing how technology is built and how it works and who it impacts, and then try to rectify those gaps, try to fill in those gaps. So I think we're at time. Thank you so much to my co-panelists, Gabrielle and Catherine. I'm just so delighted we got to have this conversation. And I hope those of you watching continue to ask your own questions, and that you enjoyed this kind of provocative conversation around ethics and AI. Over to you, Kelly, I think.
Yes, Kira, thank you so much for moderating today's discussion around the ethics and power of AI in the workplace. Gabby and Catherine, your insights have been really interesting to listen to, and I've run out of space for notes today. We really also appreciate the time and effort you took in preparing your notes for today and sharing your experiences and knowledge with the full William & Mary community around connecting AI to our work and considering how it can be useful while also being skeptical. I really appreciate the value of the liberal arts experience being a benefit to your work today and reminding us of the necessity of critical thinking and asking good questions. As Michael mentioned at the beginning of today's session, we're working to incorporate the NACE career readiness competencies throughout the week, and technology, critical thinking were definitely throughout a thread throughout the discussion today. For those of you listening, you joined for your own professional development. So we have, as a reminder to you, to go ahead and write something down for yourself as a goal. What are you going to do with this information now that you have it? What's next for you? And to continue the conversation, I'm going to pass it over to Alex.
Thanks, Kelly. Well, thank you everyone for being part of today's session. I really encourage you to join us this afternoon for Tools for Productive Conflict at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Your continued participation is greatly appreciated. We also have another session that I'd like to recommend and encourage you to join on Friday, which is our online networking hour. It's a great opportunity to connect with the entire William & Mary community on one-on-one 8-minute chats that can be video, audio, or text-based, so we can sort of meet you wherever you are tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. We've learned so many great things from the panel today. I would encourage you all, and I'm just going to quickly share my screen. I would encourage you all to hop on One Network. If you haven't already joined, be sure to join. But we have a thread for today's conversation. I'd love if you learned something from the great panel today and want to drop it in as a comment. I'm sure others would love to hear what you took away from today's session. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.